Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tom Liney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center, as many of you know, sponsors a range of conferences, lectures, special events that, that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. A great core part of our mission is to foster greater Jewish-Christian understanding through two initiatives: the Kraft-Hiatt program for Jewish-Christian understanding, which brings us here today, and Readings from the Roots, which helps clergy and churches nationwide think about how the scripture they use on Sundays could avoid anti-Jewish biases in translation and preaching. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Hasia Diner to campus. She is a renowned scholar of American Jewish history, as well as a brilliant and unusually prolific writer. She's authored and edited 21 major volumes over the course of her career on topics as disparate as Black-Jewish relations, immigrant foodways, Jewish women's history, and Holocaust memory. Her most recent research interest, which brings her here today, is the interaction between Irish Americans and Jewish immigrants in the latter 19th and early 20th centuries. Since retiring from her New York University professorship in 2023, Hasia is Professor Emerita at NYU, New York University, and director of the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History. She's earned the highest honors in her field, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service from the American Jewish Historical Society, and the Saul Weiner Prize for Outstanding Books in American Jewish History, even a James Beard nomination for food writing, and numerous national book awards. Please join me in welcoming Hasia Diner. Thank you.
I think I get a little water.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for such lovely words, and thank you all for being here, and Professor O'Donnell for, he was my interlocutor at my first book talk, and actually Professor Leah Cohen, who's my friend from Brookline, belong to the same synagogue. So it's really lovely to be here. So let me begin. So a songwriting duo, two guys who wrote a song together, churned out, in fact, many, many tunes on New York's Tin Pan Alley, sort of a set of buildings in the East 20s where popular musicians, okay, lyricists, piano pluggers, wrote music and tried to sell them to record producers, and they produced sheet music and the like. So these two songwriters, William Jerome, who was born William Flannery, of Irish immigrant parents, and Jean Schwartz, a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, produced in 1912 a lighthearted piece, actually quite silly, but one I think that packs quite a historical punch. So the song was called "If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews." Okay, and they extolled in America, in the song, which they called America Yankee Land, as the only place in the world where they two, a Jew and an Irishman, could come together, produce music, and they said the two of them, the Irish and the Jews, helped make possible American democracy. So I am not going to sing it. You wouldn't want me to if I chose, but here are some of the lyrics. So I just returned from Europe. I've seen London and Paris, and I'm really glad to be back in Yankee Land. In fact, the little USA looks better to me now. It's a real place. It's a place which people understand, but still I often wonder what this land would ever be if it wasn't for a Rosenstein or a Hughes. We'd surely have a kingdom, but that would be no democracy if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. I'm just going to pick a few other lines. What would this great Yankee nation really ever do if it wasn't for a Levy, a Monahan, or Donahue? Okay, and they go on to various aspects of American theater life, New York City politics, and the like. The last verse, in a way, kind of captures the whole thing. Talk about a combination, heed my words and make a note. On St. Patrick's Day, Rosinski pins a shamrock on his coat. There's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos, why Tammany and I'm going to introduce Tammany in a second, why Tammany would surely fall. There'd be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. So just parenthetically, Tammany was the democratic political machine in New York. So this song, which was recorded multiple times, you can find it on YouTube, offers a clever way to start thinking about the alchemy that took place in the United States when Irish Catholics and Jewish immigrants and their immediate descendants worked together to remake urban America. Now, Irish and Jewish newcomers as individuals and through the actions of their community worked together to dislodge the nativist Protestant conceit that the nation was theirs, okay, and that these two, the Irish and the Jews, were involved in a project of trying to create a more inclusive nation, which is indeed the theme of my talk. Now, before I go any further, I think it's important to note that these are people who, had they not moved to America, would have never met. They had no prehistory. There was a tiny, tiny Jewish community in Ireland, and it actually began to develop well after the massive waves of Irish immigrants came to America. And certainly Jews in the places they had come from, Central and Eastern Europe, never knew anybody who was Irish. It was a concept that wasn't in their understanding of the nature of the world. But in America, these two, okay, met each other in awfully ordinary places, in the halls of apartment buildings, on the stoops of their tenements, on street corners, in shops, in schools. We have lots of evidence of romance and marriage between them. They were involved in theater and popular music, like Jerome and Schwartz, and in various and sundry other places. Irish and Jewish young men served in the same units during World War I. So they met each other, we might say, in the barracks and in the trenches. They collaborated in classrooms and in labor union meeting halls and in the smoke-filled back rooms of various and sundry political organizations like New York's Tammany Hall, which the song referred to. They came together by dint of circumstance. They didn't come together because they loved each other or they wanted to engage in some kind of multicultural process. Neither the Irish nor the Jews purposely set out to break down the social and cultural barriers between them, and religious boundaries for sure divided them. Each remained fiercely committed to their own communities and traditions, but both learned that they had something to gain by working with the other. So in this American drama that I'm going to be laying out for you, the Irish and the Jews, I'm giving top billing to the Jews. In fact, the book, which is called The Unlikely Alliance Between the Irish and the Jews, was originally called How the Irish Helped the Jews Become American. My publisher did not like that and decided to change the title. But in this American drama, I give top billing to the Irish, whether as immigrants or the American-born. The Jews are in Best Supporting Actor category, since we just finished with the Oscars. They receive secondary importance inasmuch as the Irish had arrived earlier in massive numbers, far beyond the number of Jews who came to the United States, and their arrival thoroughly turned Protestant America into a tizzy, into a panic. The Irish came to create and dominate institutions in American life, and here the political machine and the labor movement are particularly important, and these were crucially important to Jews as immigrants who sought to make a home in their new American life. I want to show this in terms of the way in which the Irish functioned as the guides and at times as the defenders of the Jews who immigrated in much smaller number, much later, and much later. In such diverse fields as education, urban politics, labor organizing, the Irish shepherded the Jews through the process of becoming American, demonstrating to them how to navigate them and master the intricacies of the American system. So the Irish were the tutors, the Jews the students, the Irish the teachers, the Jews the pupils. Now, the way I'm going to tell the story kind of goes against the grain in terms of how the history of the Irish and Jewish connection in America has ordinarily been told. For most of my fellow scholars in American Jewish history, this has been a history of Irish anti-Semitism. It's been a history of Irish boys beating up hapless Jews on the street, usually Jewish boys. Okay, somehow girls and adults never figure into that story, but it's usually boys. More importantly, my fellow scholars of American Jewish history have pointed out random bits from the Irish American press, particularly that which was somewhat nationalist-oriented, as well as sermons from Irish priests who thundered to their parishioners about the eternal guilt of the Jews for having perpetrated the crucifixion. Probably most important in shaping the way historians have looked at this is the uncontrovertible rantings and ravings of Father Charles Coughlin, the flamboyant radio priest who in the 1930s, broadcasting from Detroit, had a weekly audience of, they say, 30 to 40 million listeners. And Father Coughlin became an anti-Semite. It's a very complicated story, but by 1936, he became an out-and-out anti-Semite, blaming the Jews for everything. And I could only pick one quote from one of his sermons, but this was the one he offered the night after Kristallnacht, 1938, when all the synagogues of Germany were burnt down and the windows of the Jewish shops broken. And Coughlin said, "Wait until Hitler comes to America." Okay, predicting that he and his minions would greet Hitler warmly. So I don't mean to say that those things didn't happen. They did. There's just absolutely no way around it. But I just don't think that's the whole story. And rather, the Irish had an interest, they had a stake in becoming the guides, the teachers, the helpers of the new Jewish immigrants. It worked for them. And it worked for them, and they took up this responsibility because it served their own interests. Now, again, for sure, friendships developed, and as I said, there were even romances and marriages. But importantly, this is a story of self-interest on both sides. The Jews turned to the Irish because they needed them, and the Irish understood that they would derive some benefit from doing what they did. So rather than talk about this in the abstract, I'm going to turn to a few aspects or a few zones in which this defender-mentor relationship took place. So let me begin with, in fact, defense. So over the course of the years from the 1870s into the 1930s, Jews sought out Irish politicians, writers, journalists, and others to speak for them when they felt they were not able to do so for themselves, given the level of anti-Semitism in the country and given their own small number. So here are just going to be a few examples, and I'm always frustrated in a talk because I could obviously go on for hours. So in the 1870s and 1880s, Rabbi Solomon Schindler of Boston's Ohabei Shalom collaborated with the two editors of the Boston Catholic newspaper, the Boston Pilot, John Boyle O'Reilly, a very important Irish nationalist, and his successor John Roach, to plant in the Pilot articles condemning anti-Semitism, whether abroad, nationally, or most importantly in Boston, and particularly when those acts of anti-Semitism were perpetrated by the white Anglo, what they were called in Boston, Brahmin elite. That is exactly the people who deprecated the Irish themselves. So O'Reilly and Roach, at the instigation and help and the suggestion of Schindler, were able to attack their enemies through the name of the Jews. Anytime anything happened at Harvard or on Beacon Hill or in the Back Bay, where some local Protestant did something that smacked of anti-Semitism, it got huge coverage in the Pilot. This was not an isolated Boston story, and it had a New York chapter as well. In 1893, a group of elite American Jews, a number of individuals associated with the American Jewish Historical Society, approached a man by the name of Charles P. Daly, born in County Galway, who was then the sitting Chief Justice of the New York Court of Common Pleas, to publish a book about the Jews of the United States. Okay, Daly had long connections to the local Jewish organizations and help institutions, and at their behest, in a book published by the American Hebrew, Daly wrote a book called The Settlement of the Jews of North America. It was a rousing tribute to the Jewish people, and he wrote, as no Jew before him had ever done, that the Jews had been present in the United States since the 17th century, so they shouldn't be considered aliens or immigrants. And this is a time when immigration restriction was becoming a very powerful political issue. Daly also published a smaller book on the Jews of New York, again, a way to show that Jews had been there for centuries, they were an integral part of the city's life, they contributed to the common good, and they always took care of their own poor. That the two books appeared under the publishing imprimatur of the American Hebrew, an American Jewish communal agency at the time shows how important these Jewish communal leaders considered it to have the word out as nativism and anti-Semitism was growing. But had they said these things by themselves or for themselves, it would have just been looked upon as special pleading. But in the words of Charles P. Daly, an operative of Tammany Hall, a president of one of the major Irish nationalist organizations, it came across as admiration and not self-interest. Now, this Jewish reliance on Irish individuals to act in their behest went on into the early 20th century, and it went on to a national stage. In April 1903, the Irish nationalist and globe-trotting journalist Michael Davitt went to the Moldavian city of Kishinev, a city in the Russian Empire, to investigate the pogrom that had just taken place in that city. Davitt went there at the behest of as a journalist for the Hearst newspapers, and American Jews, leaders of the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Publication Society of America, reached out to Davitt when he came back to the United States and asked him if he would bundle together all of his articles about the pogrom and publish it as a book. So with Davitt's permission, the Jewish Publication Society of America issued this book called Within the Pale, the true story of anti-Semitic persecution in Russia. The book is the first book on the pogrom. It's the first book to introduce the word pogrom into the American lexicon. Okay, and it was widely read, reviewed in the New York Times, reviewed in publications all over the country. And again, as in the case of Charles P. Daly's book, the fact that Davitt was not a Jew meant everything, because it wasn't the Jews pleading for continued open immigration to the United States, but rather it was an Irishman. Okay, this goes on. I'm just going to give a few more examples of this phenomenon. In 1924, Edward F. McSweeney, who was the president of the Knights of Columbus, a thoroughly Irish organization, was terribly concerned about the pernicious impact of the Ku Klux Klan, which was in its heyday in the early 1920s. We refer to this as the second Klan. It's sort of different than the Klan of the post-Reconstruction era. That Klan after World War I was anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-African-American, obviously, but most profoundly anti-Catholic. Its anti-Catholicism was at the heart of its agenda. And so Edward F. McSweeney decided that what the Knights of Columbus should do is publish a whole shelf load of books called The Racial Contribution to America. And it was going to take every ethnic group and have a writer from that group publish a book about their group. Okay, so it's going to be maybe 20 volumes that would fit beautifully on a library shelf. Well, they ran out of money, or he ran out of money, and only 3 were published. One was about Germans, One, amazingly, was written by W.E.B. Du Bois, focused on African Americans. But the third one that came out was George Cohen's Homage to the Jew, the Jew's Contribution to American Society. And like Charles P. Daly in the 1890s, he extolled the Jews, and he said the Jew has made himself part and parcel of American life, but a book published by the Knights of Columbus, okay, an organization that couldn't be confused for anything else other than Catholic. Let me just give two more quick other examples of this kind, neither involving writing, but and both involving politics. So in 1936, as you may know, the Olympics were to be held in Berlin. Jewish organizations, Jewish athletes were appalled, terrified that this was going to happen. What would happen to the Jewish athletes in Nazi Germany? Would a Jewish athlete who won have to give a Heil Hitler salute when he or she received a medal? Would they be segregated? Would they be persecuted? And a number of Jewish athletes approached a man by the name of Jeremiah Mahoney, okay, a judge in New York who wanted to become mayor. It's good to, kind of, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. Mahoney was the president of the Amateur Athletic Union, and it was Mahoney who ran the campaign to get the United States to boycott the Olympics. He failed, but he was the one out of his own coffers hired researchers in Germany to find out what was happening, and he approached the American Olympic Commission several times trying to get them, in the name of the Jews, to have the United States stay home and not participate. When he lost, he quit the American Olympic Commission. Okay, and then in that last era of the 1930s, a Jewish congressman from Brooklyn, Samuel Dickstein, was quite worried about the level of pro-Nazi activity in the United States as early as 1933 and 1934, and he wanted Congress to create an ad hoc committee to investigate Nazi activity in the United States. He, however, thought he couldn't do that as a Jew, and so who did he turn to but John McCormack, okay, the congressman from Boston, who was later the Speaker of the House. And so McCormack agreed to do this, although he was not the voice of the committee, it was Dickstein, but on paper, it was McCormack's committee, allowing Dickstein to do his work, but not being publicly associated with this crusade against Nazism. So here we get the defense of the Jews. Next, I want to look to what that lighthearted song, If It Weren't for the Irish and the Jews, noted. At one point it said, there's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos. Tammany would surely fall. There'd be no hall at all if it weren't for the Irish and the Jews. Coming into America and settling in its largest cities, New York in particular, but also Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, Providence, Jews entered a world of politics dominated by Irish men. From the lowest levels all the way up by then to City Hall, the Irish controlled the machinery of urban politics and urban government. Historians of the Irish, better than me, Professor O'Donnell, have told this story and tried to explain why the Irish were so adept at urban politics, but whatever the reason, they paved a way for all subsequent white male immigrants, and not for Jews. But for Jews, this represented an important time in their history. They came to America with no experience of having been wooed and courted and treated well by some political force that wanted only one thing from them, their votes, okay? So all the Irish wanted, their votes and maybe a little support, going around and knocking on their neighbors' doors and saying, hey, come out and vote for this one or that one. In America, a Jewish man's vote mattered just as much as any other male vote. So in every city to which they went, Jewish men encountered Irish politicians, and Irish politicians recognized that this was a group of people who were never going back to where they came from, okay, as opposed to the Italians. Okay, they were never going back. They were becoming naturalized. They were becoming citizens, and that meant they could vote. So Irish political leaders, again, in all those cities and so many more, showed up at Jewish weddings and Jewish funerals. There's a little book by George Washington Plunkett, the Plunkett of Tammany Hall. He was one of these Irish bosses, and he said, when I go to a Jewish wedding, I always make sure to sit in the front. Okay, so everybody will see me. Okay, so they came to Jewish weddings and funerals, to bar mitzvah ceremonies, to synagogue dedications, to meetings of B'nai B'rith lodges, Landsmannschaften, that is hometown societies of Jews, particularly from places in Poland, and any place where they could find clusters of Jews. Tammany Hall paid for the publication of the first long-running Yiddish newspaper in New York. Okay, der Wahrheit. Now, all the other Jewish newspapers, particularly those dominated by the socialists, considered the Wahrheit a rag. This is just a Tammany rag, but the fact is, Tammany didn't care about Yiddish letters, it didn't care about Yiddish literature, Jewish news, but it sure cared a lot about what that newspaper was going to say about it and get those voters. Two just wonderful stories from New York, but this went on in Boston and elsewhere. Also, there was a very important Tammany figure named Big Tim Sullivan. And Big Tim, either he himself or one of his many underlings, set up a little table in the vestry of one of the Lower East Side synagogues, Beis HaMedrash HaGadol, every Monday and Thursday. And as the men came out from their morning services, maybe they went there to recite a memorial prayer for a deceased relative, or maybe they just went to synagogue every Monday and Thursday or every day. When they came out, there was Big Tim or one of Big Tim's compatriots who shook their hand and said, I imagine you couldn't figure out what he said. What can I do for you? What can I do for you? This is confirmed by the letters of a man named Johnny Ahern, who was Manhattan Borough president, spent some time in jail for corruption, as many of these men did. But he kept these enormous ledger books of the letters he sent, the carbon copies of the letters. I don't know if any of you know carbon copy. Maybe way past your time, those Xerox then. It was like this black piece of paper you put under the paper you were writing on, and the letters sort of showed up on another piece of paper. But the carbon copies of what he wrote, and then the letters that came to him, and they were from Jewish congregants, from Jewish New Yorkers asking Johnny to get a son out of prison, to get a job for their daughter, to find out if there's really a plot of land that was being sold that the city was going to sell, and could they get an in on the contract for that, and so many more. Johnny wrote on behest of his these Jewish voters to city officials. One that just really stood out to me was he wrote to the head of the Parks Commission and said, my Hebrew constituents would like to have a pavilion, so like a kiosk, in Central Park during their upcoming holiday. Okay, it's going to be Passover, where they can't eat any of the food being sold, so they'd like to have a special kiosk just for their acceptable food during this holiday. Okay, now I don't know what the Parks Commissioner answered, but the fact is Johnny went out for these Jewish constituents. He also wrote one letter to the Jewish poultry slaughterers, so the men, and they were men only, who killed chickens according to the Jewish dietary laws. And he said to the head of the Kosher Poultry Association, I will represent you in your conflict with the Jefferson Market. So there's Johnny, who probably didn't know the difference between kosher and unkosher. Okay, what made a chicken kosher? Okay, it's not important. He did for them, and for sure, when the next election day came up, they were there to vote for Johnny, and more than that, to tell their friends to do so as well. Okay, so a third zone, we had defending the Jews, the politics of Jews. We could have called that the Tales of Tammany and its sisters around the country. The next one is I'm going to call Lessons of Labor. This is about the labor movement. And Jewish immigrants who came to America after the 1870s streamed into the sweatshops and garment factories of the large cities, faced horrendous working conditions, low pay, and conditions which challenged the very reason for their migration. Their labor organizations, particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, founded in 1900, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union of America, organized in 1914, provided them with powerful tools from which to organize the quality of their lives, enhance their earning power, control the conditions of their labor, and secure their children's future in this capitalist economy. So the annals of American Jewish history are full of names like David Dubinsky, Rose Schneiderman, Bessie Abramowitz, Sidney Hillman, Fania Cohn, Pauline Newman, and so many more heroes of the Jewish unions. Okay, but notably, every single one of them was trained by an Irish labor activist on how to do union. The Jews came with absolutely no tradition of labor organizing. People will like to point to the Bund, the General Federation of Jewish Workers, in Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, and say that they came as labor activists, but that was not the case. It wasn't founded until the end of the 1890s, and it wasn't even legal in the Russian Empire until the 1910s. So Jewish labor militants in the United States had sources not imported from Eastern Europe, but formed in America, in the factories and in the union halls, led and dominated by Irish Americans. The Irish, and again, just as in the case of politics, why did the Irish rush to labor organizing, and why did they do so well at it is beyond my scope, but just for the purposes of our talk to say that the Knights of Labor and then the American Federation of Labor were Irish enclaves. There's an enormous book, the Dictionary of American Labor Leaders. And if you go through it, which sadly I spent many a day going through it and finding out where people were born, and the Irish dominated statistically far out of proportion to their number in the population. Okay, so Jews, as those Jewish workers who wanted to organize, who wanted to found a union, had to first turn to Irish labor activists to figure out, how do you do it? I would say, I wouldn't know how to do it. Okay, well, either did they. So I'm gonna give one example of a man named Sidney Hillman, who went on to found the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union of America. He became a very powerful force in American labor. And it is said, and I believe it's true, that during the New Deal, whenever Franklin Roosevelt had a labor question, he would always say, clear it with Sidney. Okay, so Sidney was his man in the labor movement. Well, Sidney Hillman worked in a clothing factory in Chicago. It had a union, the United Garment Workers. Hillman and several of the other young Turks thought it was an ineffective union, and they wanted to form another one, okay, a challenge, okay, which a kind of rival to the United Garment Workers. He goes to Charles Fitzpatrick, okay, the head of the Chicago Federation of Labor, and says, what do I do? Fitzpatrick gave him some good advice, and probably the most important nugget of information was he told Hillman to meet up with a woman named Agnes Nestor, an Irish-American woman who had founded the Glove Makers Union. And he said, go to Agnes Nestor and she'll show you step by step what to do. So Nestor, in her memoir, describes these meetings with Sidney Hillman, and then she says, can you believe I taught Sidney Hillman how to organize a union? This was also, by the way, very importantly, an Irish women's and a Jewish women's story in both communities. Again, women played an inordinate role in the labor movement, something not seen in any other two ethnic communities. And many of the Irish women, and particularly Leonora O'Reilly, but she's not the only one, the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had been in the Knights of Labor, took numerous Jewish women under her wing, Rose Schneiderman, Pauline Newman, the most important, and from her, as well as from a woman named Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, these Jewish women devoted their lives to the labor movement, to labor in general, to bringing up the conditions for all workers, but particularly focused on the needs of women workers. Okay. So when Newman and Schneiderman were disheartened by the actions of the Jewish men who led their own unions, they turned to O'Reilly and said, what do we do? How do we soldier on despite the lack of concern by our leaders about the conditions of of women workers. Okay, and again, so much more on that. But in this, I could certainly say that when it came to labor organizing, Jews learned and the Irish taught. But now I'm going to give you a story or a kind of sector in which the Irish really taught and the Jews really learned, and this was in public education. So in New York, Chicago, Boston, and elsewhere, from the 1870s through the 1920s, the places where American Jews were going, once they disembarked, once they disembarked from their immigrant ships, many of the children went into American classrooms where, more likely than not, the teachers who met them were Irish American women, the daughters of former domestic servants and manual labor. The hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of Jewish children who came to the United States and those born of immigrant parents here partook of their most important American lessons from these Irish women. These schools provided them probably the most crucial settings in which Irish Americans taught Jews to become American. Now, Jews have made much about their success in education, but have rarely stopped to ask the question, well, who taught them? Okay, and the answer is Irish women. These women were the exemplars of what it meant to be American to these kids. How to speak American, how to speak grammatical English, how to look like American, how to dress like an American, how to wear their hair like American. Okay, they were the models of American. Their very comportment conveyed the ideals of American middle-class life. It mattered little that these Irish teachers came from working-class families, but they were thoroughly American in their presentation. To the Jewish presentations, to the Jewish children, to the Jewish immigrant children, fresh from Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, Galicia, and elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and from their awestruck parents, because we have lots of memoir material on this. These teachers were wonderful. They loved them. Irving Howe, who wrote This World of Our Fathers, this very big kind of coffee table book about East European Jewish immigrants, had a bevy of research assistants working for him. Just at one point in his text says, surely there must have been a bigot or two among them, but not if you read the memoir literature, where the kids talked about these teachers as encouraging them, pushing them, praising them, and considering that it was important that they not only get this education, but that they go on and get more. So the very important journalist, Nat Hentoff, very important jazz critic, and also civil libertarian, who grew up in Boston, talks about his Irish-American teacher. He said he was a pretty terrible student, and his teacher, Miss O'Day, met with his mother, came to the house and told his mother, this boy is really smart, and he can go to the Latin school. Okay, I suggest you let he take the test and he go to the Latin school. And Hentoff describes his first day of entering the Latin school and going into the door, through the doors, and there on the walls are the pictures of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Charles Evans. He said it really made him feel like an American. And if not for that teacher, he might have not even gone to high school, at a time when high school was not mandatory. So this encounter between Jewish students and Irish teachers was a very profound one. We actually learn a little bit about it by a woman, the writings of a woman named Myra Kelly. She was born in Dublin in the late 19th century, and she came to the United States with her father, who was a physician who had a practice on New York's Lower East Side with complete Jewish clientele. She was a teacher for a while in PS 147 in the Jewish enclave. We know about her because she decided to stop being a teacher and to become a writer, and she wrote a series of short stories which appeared in some very prestigious magazines, and then the articles blossomed into books, and she has a book called Little Citizens, Wards of Liberty, Little Aliens, And while it sounds a little condescending, they were aliens. They were unfamiliar. They were foreign to the American experience. And she praised these children as so eager to learn, and their parents so cooperative with whatever the school might be asking. So the idea of Jews learning from Irish teachers can't be underestimated in this crucial aspect of American life. And since I'm here at Holy Cross, I'm going to turn to a final last setting in which Jews gained access to America by means of Irish teachers. And these are encounters that took place in a range of Catholic universities which opened their doors to Jewish students. At schools like Notre Dame, okay, think the Fighting Irish, Fordham, Georgetown, Creighton in Omaha, Providence College, and St. John's, which was then in Brooklyn, not Queens, and particularly in the professional schools of law, medicine, pharmacy, business, dentistry. These became, in the 1920s, safe spaces for Jewish students. As other schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, they can all just roll off your tongue, erected quotas against Jewish students, or in some cases completely barred them. These Catholic schools opened their doors. And by the way, I do have in the book a really nice little anecdote from Holy Cross. While even some Jewish undergraduates attended these schools, and their stories deserve to be told, it was in these professional schools founded by Irish founders, had Irish administrators, Irish alumni, Irish boards of trustees, and faculty. They saw Jewish students not as people to be kept out, but rather as qualified applicants who would pay tuition, perform satisfactorily, and certainly no less than the Catholic students who attended these schools. And perhaps some of them would in fact become grateful donors as time went on. I'm going to just offer the story of one such person, Louis Lefkowitz, who was the long-standing Attorney General of the state of New York. If you happen to be in Lower Manhattan, you'll see the Louis Lefkowitz State Building. And Louis Lefkowitz, as a man, attended Fordham Law School. This is a time when law schools didn't require an undergraduate degree. So he lived at home, worked in his family's grocery store in the odd hours between classes, and he went to Fordham Law School. At first at night, and many of these Catholic schools offered night classes in the professional divisions. So it meant somebody could work and then go to school at night. And he became a lawyer. He was, again, a very important figure in New York politics and a thorough and generous donor to Fordham University. He remained a lifelong supporter of the school, using his name and networks to support Fordham. In the years that the young Lefkowitz attended these Jesuit Irish-dominated schools, in Lefkowitz's years, Jews made up about 15% of the Fordham Law School population, but by the 1930s, they were almost 50%, and they are 60% of the pharmacy students, okay, by the 1930s. So, and St. John's also had a very robust Jewish population, and it was very active in accepting Jewish students. Indeed, I want to note that it was 1922 when Harvard implemented its quota against Jewish students, and in that year, Loyola of Chicago placed an ad in the city's Jewish newspapers welcoming Jewish applicants to Loyola. Now, did they do that because of the Harvard quota? I can't say. It's a very interesting coincidence that as those doors got shut, these other ones got opened. So beyond the realm of the obvious, these students would fill up classrooms and moot court rooms and laboratories and pay tuition. This all took place in the 1920s, and that mattered too, that decade which saw the vast rise of anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic sentiment. As I said before, the Ku Klux Klan spiked in those years and were terribly frightening to both Jews and Catholics. So the Catholic professional schools understood that they had something to gain, again, beyond their admissions policies, that they did not share in the prejudice of other Americans. Other Americans, be they redneck Klansmen, or be they the presidents and boards of trustees of Harvard, two ends of the class spectrum, they, Irish Catholics, did not subscribe to that same anti-Semitic ideology. They didn't share in the prejudices which prevailed. So by doing so, they made a moral statement announcing that Catholics, and frankly, as Irish people, which in much of their writing they didn't share in the hatred against Jews seizing the nation. They made a statement that those white Protestant Americans who saw the Irish as illiberal, unmodern, drunken bigots were unfit for inclusion into American life were wrong. They, the Irish Catholics, were in fact the pillars of liberalism in the United States, and their admissions policies bore witness to that liberalism which they wanted to show. So I'm going to draw this to a close. It'll come full circle, going back to the song. So in all those ways and places that I've laid out, these ways and places of allyship, which is a word I think is not really a word, because my computer always puts a red line on it underneath it, but I use it anyhow because I think it's actually a very important word. In all these situations of allyship, Jews derived benefit greatly from Irish guidance, and the Irish derived benefits as well from the role they played. So as the song told us, with these two together help make what would be a democracy. Thank you.